Solo Sam back with another episode. I'm mostly training, solo, of course, and we are restored power and we are trimmed and groomed, which is necessary. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different, and I'll get to that. Firstly, I will talk about my training, which is a big portion of the Solo Sam, is to let you know what's going on with me, occasionally to answer some questions, but to give a little bit more context to my thoughts on training and how my training is going. Not that I think my training is the most important thing in the world, but it's the training that I can speak with the most detail about. And we are very much in the midst of it. Specifically, this is another one of these episodes where I feel like it's important to give sufficient context, especially when things aren't going well, because when I inevitably attain my goals, which for now is a 300 kilogram deadlift and then a sub 3 hour marathon, either on the same day or the following day, and this is at some point in the future, if I don't show the hiccups along the way, then it's easy for people to assume, oh, well, that was easy for him. He could do that, but I can't do the things within my life that may be a stretch because this is all the disruptions that are potentially going to occur. And I want to indicate that disruptions are normal. They're not desirable and you do your best to avoid them, but they do occur. And any prior thing that I've done that was notable, there were disruptions there too. And I would have happily spoken to those at the time, not to celebrate it, but just to share what's really going on. The challenging part is when most of your sharing is done via social media, when there's something that can't be shared, you can say, hey, this is what I did in training, but it's harder to say, this is what I did when I wasn't in training. For example, right now, to get to the fucking point, it would have been a great week post cyclonic disruption to rip into training. But unfortunately, I'm sick, not sick, end of the world sick, but sick enough where today it made much more sense to not train or to do yoga, soft tissue, some easy walking, basically non-training training made more sense than what I had planned, which was to lift weights and go for a run. I don't want to get sick, but I have a toddler in daycare, and toddlers in daycare, no matter how much you pump them with good food and they have consistent sleep and solid immune systems, occasionally sickness occurs. And I'm in very, very close proximity to my son, and we cuddle a lot. I'm in his bed watching Transformers on my phone. So when he's been sick, which he has been, and he's coughing and sneezing on my face, much as I may hope, and oftentimes I am able to withstand the immunity barrage. In this instance, with some additional stress from the cyclone, stress from life, but in particular from the disruptions that occurred, combined with what I believe is a big factor, a lot less sunlight. The cyclone meant a lot of rain, overcast conditions, not conducive to getting outside, which I normally do. And I think my consistent exposure to sunlight helps preserve my immunity. And so I had worse sleep, worse food, no sunlight, sneezing and coughing on my face, and sickness, which during the day doesn't feel too bad, in that I was able to get some training in on Monday and Tuesday. It was a little bit labored, but not too bad. But sleep has been an issue. So at night, just with congestion, I either spend the whole night blowing my nose, which doesn't really help alleviate the blockage persistently. You can even, right now, I can't a little bit long. It's because I'm congested and I am a persistent nose breather. Mouth breathing is something I do very rarely in maybe 10 to 20% of my exercise. which means that 80% of the training I do, even the aerobic stuff, is nose breathing. So mouth breathing is something that's only occurs as needed. And I can delve into the reasons for that another time. I have extensively previously. You can look it up if you're curious and impatient, but you want to breathe through your nose. It's how we're designed. We're supposed to talk and eat with our mouths, but breathe through our noses for the most part. But at night, that's been impossible for me. So I've been mouth breathing all night. This morning, I woke up early because it just was that uncomfortable to even lie down in bed that it made more sense to get up, even though I could have used the sleep. Headache, just pressure in my ears. So I felt like I was going up and down an altitude and hadn't gone anywhere. And rather than see if I could train today and just hope that things would turn out all right, it made far more sense to exercise some caution and not train today, or not do the training as intended, which is not what I want to do. I want to train. I don't want to even be talking about this. I don't want to be sick. I don't like any part about it other than to be honest and to share what's actually going on in order to give context to what it looks like when you're going about pursuing a performance goal. It might be easy, or it may occur for some of you that you have an aspiration and you have a plan, and then that plan gets disrupted and it feels harder than you originally intended. And so then the plan is abandoned because it was harder than expected. And there are times when that's necessary and unavoidable. Like if I snap my femur in half right now because I got hit by a truck walking down the road, yeah, that might cause a big adjustment of my goals. I wouldn't even say that it would mean that my goals would become obsolete, but they would certainly move further into the distance. There's going to be normal disruptions within the course of your life, and they could be on the daily. Something happens to a family member, traffic, things pop up with work and family, and you have to adjust training, or you get sick, or you get injured. And that's normal. These are the challenges that occur even with professional athletes, and they too have to make adjustments, but you might not normally have visibility to that. You might not have the person talk about that whilst it's occurring. So it may seem like when something like that occurs to you that you are an anomaly or you're on your own, and there can be some victim stuff and this is why me and it's too hard. And I have the slightest amount of that presents as just frustration with how things are, because of course this isn't exactly what I'd hoped for. But I also, the bigger part of me is accepts that this is what it is, and that this is what happens, and there's likely to be further disruptions in the future, and I'll have to adjust and overcome those, which is also why I don't really put a lot of stock in a specific training program, because what I had programmed for this week, which would feed into what I had programmed for next week, and all of that would be shot to shit because I couldn't train today, and because training will be adjusted most likely tomorrow. And that means that I'm going to have to see how I'm doing and feeling by the weekend in order to make plans for next week, and so on. So you have to play it as it comes. And all of this is, I hope it presents as, I get it, I'm here with you, I'm experiencing the thing myself. This is normal, and not as, I feel so bad for myself that I'm sick. That part exists a little bit. I don't want to, was not, I wouldn't say grumpy, but I wasn't my most positive self this morning. I'm just feeling shit, and I'm accepting, coming to terms with what today and the following day might look like, which is just different than what I had planned. But then that is the process. You have to accept what is, adjust, and then get on with it, which is what I'm doing. Prior to today, yesterday, there's been a bit of a shift in terms of my intention when it comes to how I'm executing my runs. And I talked about this on Instagram a little bit yesterday, which is just to set some limitations on how hard I'm pushing in my runs in order to play the long game. So instead of maximizing my effort in terms of running as fast as possible on any given run, which is what I'm inclined to do, what I'm doing is trying to keep things as easy / moderate as possible. I still have this attachment to the numbers that I see on my Garmin, some of which is the heart rate, and I want an attachment to that, although with some caveats. But I'm trying to become unattached to the speed right now, even though the speed, of course, will become very relevant as I progress closer to my goals. And the thing that I think of now is, and those of you that were Princeton University heavyweight rowers circa 2004 to 2006 would remember husky runs. This is basically a weight management strategy for those of us on the team at the time that had perhaps non-prototypical rowing builds, thicker, bigger frames that would benefit from some additional cardio. And we would go running, sometimes solo, sometimes as a group. And the intensity, the speed was basically inconsequential. We would go out and jog is effectively what it is. And there was plenty of hard training going on usually prior to those sessions. So this might be an add-on after a row. Excuse me, I just need to blow my nose a little bit. Apologies. But these were the sort of runs that wouldn't generate an awful lot of fatigue. So you could do them frequently without it disrupting the general thrust of what we were trying to do as a crew or as a program. So you could tack them on perhaps before a session, usually after, but if you're training AM, PM, and it's going to occur in the middle of the day, then it's going to be both after and before. And I've been trying to reconnect with those, which at the time I didn't have any speed on my Garmin. I don't even have a Garmin at that stage. I probably wasn't even wearing a heart rate monitor. So it was just find an intensity that wouldn't cause fatigue and would allow you to run with others and perhaps even have a chat while you're doing it, which wasn't the goal, but did indicate something about the intensity of the run, which is really where I need to be at the moment, accumulating minutes, but also continuity. So if I were at this stage to aim for 4 runs and 2 of them were going to have some speed, or even be at a output that was slightly higher as opposed to slightly lower, I'm talking speed and heart rate and effort, then maybe for a given session, I could run a certain distance faster, but that might not positively contribute to the ability to do the same or more the following week or in the following months. Because I'm not near peaking performance, and because I'm off the back of a big chunk of time where I have built my frame and had minimized the cardio and in particular the running output, I'm not starting from scratch, but it's something like that. Now I still have the memories of running along at 4-minute Ks without too much problem. 4 minutes to 4:30 was sort of my bread and butter in training. It would be put shoes on and bang, like I would be into it and running at that sort of clip. So that's a 45-minute 10K to a 40-minute 10K as a normal training run. Now, my reflection from that would be that there would have been a benefit to do more longer or slower, easier stuff, moderate that intensity some of the time so I could push harder other times rather than this semi-hard stuff all the time. In any event, none of that is reasonable now. So I'm reconnecting with my husky runs. I'm building what I describe as have less attachment to the speed for now, with a focus on building consistency and continuity. And that is allowing me to have a little less in the way of niggles, so more consistency, as I've spoken to, and building efficiency and running economy rather than building running performance. So running around the 5:30 to 6 minute plus pace, which feels very slow for right now, though, that's where I need to be. That's to remind myself, saying this publicly is, it comes across, and my post did, because I heard from some people, maybe some of you, that said, hey, thanks for this. It did so and so for me. Maybe a reminder for those people. But what it does for me is to make a declaration of sorts as to, hey, this is where I'm at. This is how I'm thinking about it. This is what I need to do. So then I go ahead and do it, because my instinct is still to put on my running shoes and to press start on my Garmin and then to go pretty hard. But that's not going to help where I need to be in playing the long game. So that's what I'm doing. Husky runs. One thing I did want to touch on today is, because I'm talking about Garmin's, and it could be Garmin, Polar, any other heart rate monitor. I'll speak a little bit more on the Whoop and Aura rings, because I certainly have a developed opinion on those. But just, I want people to think about their tech in general, specifically Garmin's. When I started wearing heart rate monitors back in the 90s, you had heart rate, it would beep if you, would have been some of the older Polar variants. This is, I think, before Garmin even existed. If your heart rate went above a specific zone, it would start beeping. You had time. I didn't have speed. So if I went for a run, the intensity and the speed would be determined by the heart rate. So if I was trying to be in a specific zone, keep it T2, then that would have been the thing that I'm observing, with the speed being whatever it needs to be, which would make sense for what I'm doing now, actually. But you can't get these dumber devices, which is what I would aim for. What you get instead is all of these additional features, some of which aren't even close to accurate. And one of my main bugaboos, for example, with Garmin, is that it makes these estimations and inferences from the data that it captures, and then kind of compels you to observe it regardless of how relevant or accurate it is. Case in point, it takes the first kilometer of any run that I do, and then takes my max, whatever the heart rate is, my average heart rate by that point, with the speed, and then assumes my VO2 from those two metrics, which is not going to be even close to accurate for a few reasons. One of those reasons is it doesn't know anything about what you've done beforehand. So it doesn't know if I'm going for a run and that's the first thing I've done that day, and I've had 2 days of rest, which is to say I'm sufficiently recovered, or if I've done a 2-hour weight session just before that run. Obviously, what you do beforehand is going to have a big effect on your performance, which is both your heart rate and your speed for the whole run, but also for the first kilometer. And it doesn't capture or ask any of that, but it still says, hey, this is what your VO2 is. And if those metrics, for whatever reason, so if it were really hot and humid, and I'd done a lot of training beforehand, and it had a lot of caffeine, my heart rate might be elevated and my speed might be the same or slower. So it would say your VO2 is lower when, in fact, it's not any lower at all. the inverse of the conditions could also be true. You could say you could be recovered, it could be cool, you could have not had much caffeine, and therefore your heart rate relatively is suppressed, which presents as an improvement in VO2, which it's also not. So you can't really put any stock in that at all. And you have to turn that off rather than it's an opt out rather than opt in. And I had to go through some steps like, I don't fucking want to know that. It's not relevant and it's not accurate, which is why it's not relevant. And it does any number of those things. It assumes uh, your training volume based on, well, it's not even your volume. It's your, I can't remember the specific, what the phraseology is, but it takes the volume that you accumulate, and it could be for running and whatever you're tracking, and the intensity at which you do it, which is just assuming your heart rate, but it doesn't factor in any of the things you do that aren't recorded by a Garmin in a given week, which could be weights, but it also could be a lot of non-exercise activity. You could do a shitload of, for me, work on the farm. I'm not wearing a Garmin, but it certainly contributes to the overall volume of physical work that I'm doing, but none of that shows up. But it'll insist this is what's happening regardless. What I would want is just to get the actual metrics that I want: heart rate, time, occasionally speed, and that's it. But that would probably not have an awful lot of palatability for the consumer because they think that, oh, I get to know my VO2, so that's better, right? Because now I know what my VO2 is and I know VO2 is important. So now that I have it, that's a good thing. But VO2, for it to be accurate or even close to accurate, it needs to happen in a lab. You need to be wearing a snorkel. There needs to be a physiologist there. And if those things aren't happening, then you don't know your VO2. And even if those things are happening, there's still things that may influence the results that means you don't have an accurate reflection of what your VO2 is. And even if those things are neutral or non-impactful, and you do get an accurate depiction of your VO2, that doesn't necessarily indicate anything about what your performance is going to be. It's just a nice to have some of the time. But it may not be relevant for you, and it most likely is a distraction. So the takeaway here is I get annoyed with this insistence on these false metrics when they're hard to avoid. But for you, just to know or at least think about what numbers are worth paying attention to and which ones are not. Because if you put stock in all of it, you're going to end up being distracted and chasing your own tail. They're not all equally accurate. And I'm not talking about the accuracies of a wrist monitor versus a chest monitor. If I'm wearing it on my wrist, and I am a lot of the time, because if you've got some lats on you or just a muscular upper body, strap doesn't fit that well. It's sort of designed for Scandinavian cross-country skiers with no lats, or at least more compact upper bodies, which means for me, a strap, which is more accurate, suits certain activities. So it works for me fine on an echo bike. But when I'm running, it tends to fall off or at least slide down and be more comfortable and therefore more of a distraction than the benefit of the slightly increased accuracy of a chest strap versus a wrist monitor. So I'll concede accuracy there. I don't need it to be that precise. I'm trying to get a ballpark figure, ballpark heart rate with ballpark speed with accurate duration. That's all I need. But they're going to give you more than you want. Something to keep in mind. Okay, now for a bit of a left turn. I had another podcast back in the day, the What Farm podcast, and there's more in common with this than not. But I'm wearing a What Farm t-shirt. It's not a complete rebrand. I just wanted some separation and almost a clean slate, because there were certain things that I wanted to do last time that I either was unwilling to or didn't have the confidence to. So, for example, talking like this, where anything could happen, like my brain could shit itself, I might not know what to say, and I was worried about how that might land. I also didn't feel like I could ask people on to have a chat. Maybe if they don't want to come on, maybe they say no, maybe this is too many variables. So what I did is a means of putting something out there, but controlling for the areas in which I wasn't comfortable, was to read from my book, Lots of What's. And I've thought for most of the time since then, this would have been 2017-ish, that, and I didn't get the numbers on who was listening or not, was that it didn't do an awful lot for an awful lot of people, because you could easily buy the book for $50 or thereabouts and read it yourself. But I thought I wanted to make it available in some manner for those that didn't want to spend that money. So if they wanted to download the podcast or stream it and listen to me read it, then that was an exercise in good faith. And I was producing a podcast which created scope for it to go somewhere, and it didn't go anywhere specifically, but here we are. And maybe without that, we wouldn't be here. So it didn't count for nothing. And I've heard since, even from prior guests of the Mostly Trained podcast, that they did listen to it and it did serve a benefit. So the reason for all of that is to say that I'm going to read something today, and some of you may be interested in hearing it. And the reason I'm reading this is because it took a little while to craft, and I'm not sure if anyone fucking read it. In 2013, this was post 2 Olympic cycles. So I rode for the Australian 8, in the Australian 8, 2008 Beijing Olympics, and in the Australian 8 for the 2012 London Olympics, also in the men's 8, and was considering whether or not I wanted to go again. And it was nothing to do with my willingness to do the training. And I was still as motivated as ever. And you could see that that was the case, because all my PB on the erg was 2 years later. My world records on the erg were that year and onwards. So there was no lack of willingness to do what was required. My concern was that rowing Australia, which I felt had been, if you're a rower in Australia and you want to go to the Olympics, you're going to row in Australia is who you have to deal with, for better or worse. And when you're in the men's 8 or in the women's 8, when you're in the 8, because it has more bodies, that boat class is going to be more influenced by the bureaucracy and management from rowing Australia more broadly than any other boat class. So if you're in a pair, you're not as at the mercy or as influenced by the decisions that are made by the people that are further and further removed from what's actually going on in the boats that are wearing the Australian uniform at the Olympic Games. And so my concern was that I could train for another 4 years in good faith and do my darndest, which isn't to say I could, I was putting out perfect stuff, but I could aim to do as well as I could. And there was a likelihood that we would achieve the same result, which to me wouldn't have felt worth it, because in 2008 we came 6th. In 2012, I was the only guy that was in both of those crews, and we also came 6th. So I was prepared to, and showed up for 4 years of, I'll do whatever you say to achieve a different result. And we achieved the same result numerically. We were a lot closer. There was more success in the interim, including medals at World Cups and World Championships. But at the big dance, sixth, and then 4 years later, full time. This is what I'm doing, sixth place. So the idea of doing another 4 years and expecting a different result just for hopesies seemed a bit stupid. So in 2013, I was umming and ahhing, which I was still doing all the training and still training full time, still on the boat, still won a King's Cup that year, but was deciding whether to go back into the system all the way. And as part of that process, when I was discussing some of this with the higher ups at Rowing Australia, every time there's an Olympic cycle, especially when it doesn't go well, they bring in new people and they give the ask to a lot of the old people. Some people stick around as relics of the prior system, but there's always a shuffling of the deck. So this was the people appointed as high performance this and head coach this. And I'm not going to point out the people that made this specific request, but they were saying that for those of you that wanted to come back, you needed to write, I want to get the verbiage of this correct, what was it called? An intention and reflection, something like that. Just basically write something to indicate what you want out of the next Olympic cycle and how you're thinking about it. There wasn't an awful lot of information provided other than we need something from you. And I don't know, because there was a lack of context, if they needed it from me or they needed it from everyone. And I thought, okay, I get the purpose, and if this is what's required, if you're trying to figure out if it makes sense that I'm reintegrating and I'm trying to make sense of whether I reintegrate, then I'll jump through the hoops. And so I wrote this document and emailed it as requested on September 2nd, 2013. I don't know who was going to read it, and you'll see that as I narrate it, that I'm not sure who the audience was. I know who I sent it to because I know who requested it, but I didn't know who was going to be looking at it more broadly. I assumed that anyone at Rowing Australia could have eyes on this, so I kept that in mind. And that's not because I was going to throw a shit sandwich at anyone in particular, but just that I didn't know who the audience was. I will read it to you with this context, and then I will let you know what the reception was like on the other end. Okie dokie. So I'm not sure who will end up. Actually, let's do a little nose blow. A little nose blow. Okay. I'm not 100% sure who will. Let's do a sip first. Okay. Let's have a little. I also haven't read this since. So about 12 years. I'm not sure if I've read it in the last 12 years or maybe the last 10. I read it at the time, sent it, and then I'll let you know how it received. Anyway, obviously I didn't row it again for my country, so maybe that'll give a little peek into how things went. I'm not 100% sure who will end up reading this, but I imagine for the most part, it will be the people who I've spoken with about some of my past experiences and possibilities for the future. That being said, I want to paint a picture of what I think has led me to this point, but I am extremely aware that many aspects of the past have become redundant and no longer apply to the current Australian rowing team. In 2006, I graduated from Princeton, and my primary goal was to return to Australia, become a member of the Australian rowing team, and compete at the Beijing Olympics. Some aspects of this goal required some refinement, but as I'd always wanted to compete for my country at the highest level and decided in 2004 that I was capable of such aspirations, I knew I would take the necessary steps to make it happen. Up until 2004, I thought there was a possibility that this was not an unrealistic goal, but it was hard to gauge for sure how I demonstrate myself worthy of selection when I had zero idea what the criteria would be and how I'd assimilate into the environment that would cultivate my dream. Knowing some of the guys in the US gold medal 8, that's the US 8 from 2004 that won the Olympic gold medal, I determined that More important than athleticism, they were just guys that were really aggressive about rowing as well as possible in order to go as fast as possible. The whole time I was in Princeton, I did my best to maintain some connection with whoever I could in Australia in an effort to have somewhere or someone to go when I graduated. This was marginally successful, and I was kept somewhat in the loop by Andrew Randall, Tim McLaren, and my old colleague, Matt Ryan. From talking to them, I had some patchy understanding of what the Australian season looked like, who was who, and who went into what boat, and how these boats were chosen, etc. At the time, as you recall, rowing in and for Australia was far less integrated process, and it was pretty much impossible for me to probably comprehend anything. Randy, Matt, and Tim all did their best to answer my numerous questions, but all have their own vagaries, and I never fully got the grips of things whilst I was still in the US. The best I could do was email occasionally, train at UTS, that's University of Technology Sydney Boathouse in Haberfield in Sydney, when I was in Sydney, and fill in where possible. That included once I felt when I was 21, I went to a camp with the Australian under-23 8, filled in when they had an injury. In 2005, I filled in when they had an injury with the Australian men's senior four. So I'd been in and around guys of high caliber back home, but was separate from the system. It occurred to me that although I'd been working on my craft diligently for 4 years, it was going to be of minimal significance at all when it came to my future goals. It felt like, as far as Rowing Australia was concerned, I might as well have spent those 4 years as a Chilean shepherd. I desperately wanted a way that I could row in the Australian under-23 team during my time abroad, partly because I wanted to race, partly because I wanted to race for Australia, and partly because that way I'd have some sort of relevant results. But this was not an option at the time. This was a failing of the system that has been partially corrected over time. And just to divert here, it's certainly been further corrected. There's definitely more of a integration. But at the time that I came back and the time that I was writing this, it was not good. Despite my hopes, I was aware that I'd chosen my own path and could not begrudge any scenario I had determined for myself with full knowledge of the implications. I knew enough to understand that being able to row a small boat would be pretty crucial to my aspirations, and took steps to acquire some skills in that department. Because most 95% of our on-water training was either in the Cox 4 or the 8, several times a week I would row a pair with anyone who wanted to go out, or I'd sneak out in one of the US team single sculls. I was also aware that training back in Australia would likely contain more volume than we typically practice at Princeton, so I, schedule permitting, would add in extra sessions of various modalities whenever possible: lunch, after dinner, before and after rows. All became a chance to accumulate some minutes. Point being, I was very conscious of preparing myself as well as I knew how. After graduation, I raced for Princeton at Henley. We won, just FY, and then returned to my folks' place in Sydney. Realizing that I needed to live somewhere a lot closer to rowing facilities, I ended up staying in the garage of Maddie. This is Matt Ryan. I lived in the garage at Maddie's mum's place. This meant I could start training and get on with it, and rowing out of UTS. Training with Tim McLaren was great, but I was living a meager existence. It is a major belief of mine that if something is really important to you, then you dedicate everything you have to it. At times, I've done this to a fault and to the detriment of many components of my life I've deemed not as important. This was one of those occasions. I needed/wanted to train pretty much around the clock, and allocated and allowed as little as distraction as possible. I did some coaching in order to barely half cover my food, rent, petrol, and had some help from my parents, yet had zero disposable income. I was living in Sydney for the first time as an adult, and all my friends I hadn't been able to spend time with for 4 years were just a drive away, but I drove nowhere and saw nobody. Well, almost. I could have made more effort to be social, but I was prioritizing in an unhealthy way. Just as I was getting settled at UTS, Tim was about to move to the United States. Tim was the only reason I was at UTS, but I'd figured I'd just plug away as I didn't have any other options anyway. I pretty much did my own thing and enjoyed most of it, but my most recent previous experiences revolved a lot around atmosphere and collective determination. I was always amongst the most motivated when it came to training, but this just wasn't as much fun. Being a key member in a varsity eight of a big rowing university in the US is pretty cool experience to have for a young oarsman, in much the same way that it is at a school that values rowing. There are occasional small concessions to athletes, and the level of integration between the program and university creates a very supportive environment. There was a big difference between that and training in the dark in winter in the single in the middle of Sydney Harbour. My parents were helpful, but they were never going to offer much in the way of rowing specific guidance. Trust me when I say that I've accepted far worse living conditions I'd have accepted, which is to say I would have accepted far worse living conditions in order to pursue my goal, but I wanted to know that my efforts were being channeled towards that outcome. I started the process and was doing well in the time trials on the Nepean. This is anyone that's not on a national team would be doing these winter time trials on the Nepean River as part of the early selection process. But was quite aware that there is a big gap between doing it right in winter time trialing and being chosen as a member of the men's eight for the Olympics in less than 18 months' time. It may seem as though it would have been quite easy to get some guidance from someone at Rowing Australia, but this was not the case. I never thought I'd be presented with my Olympic tracksuit and choice of where I'd like, what seat I'd like to occupy, but I would have liked to have someone explain to me how it all worked. There's a lot you learn over time by being around. Many aspects of rowing for Australia rely on a certain assumed understanding that I simply did not possess. What was the difference between trials and selections? How important were erg scores considered? How does someone find a pair partner? What's the difference between the New South Wales Institute of Sport and the Australian Institute of Sport? And how is it determined who goes where? There were many questions like this that I couldn't get a definitive understanding of. If I knew then what I do now, I'd have realized that as long as I prepared as well as possible and learned as I went, I'd get my opportunity somewhere and it'd all be okay. But I hadn't developed that perspective yet. And although I was willing to live a very humble existence, I would only do so if it were helping my cause. If my current shit existence was not taking me closer to my goal, then I'd be happy to pursue an equally uninspiring life somewhere else that would. I knew that Richo, this is Brian Richardson, rest in peace, was coaching the men's eight. And he was the men's head coach. So he was obviously going to play an important role in realizing my aspirations. I'd gotten his phone number from somewhere, but he was overseas at the time with the Australian team. And I figured that if he had enough, that he'd have enough on his plate and that I'd call him after the World Championships, potentially when he was back in Australia. That's pretty much what I did, and I remember being pretty nervous about making the call. I trusted my ability, but I couldn't help but think if calling him was the right thing to do. Was this a serious breach of protocol I didn't know? What if he thought it was wildly presumptuous for wanting to know what I did? When I did call, Richo wasn't exactly rude, but he pretty much, as you'd imagine he would be in that instance for someone he didn't know, cold calling him. I was equal parts desperate for him to know how crucial I'd be in his future plans and for me to know when I'd get the opportunity to prove it. Richo basically heard me out and said I should do whatever time trials were coming, and then we'd see down the road. Richo wasn't unfair. He didn't know me from a bar of soap, but that didn't mean I wasn't frustrated. In my mind, I was at least comparable to Matt Ryan at the time, but I couldn't take all of the 2006 and 2007 to prove my worth. Just to say, Matt Ryan, for those that are listening, was in the current men's eight and had been on the national team, senior men's team for 2005, 6, and so he'd been for the last 2 years. Matt was the year behind me at school, and we trained together anytime I was back home. So I knew the standard that he was at. I knew the guys in the US 8, what standard they were at. And so I knew enough to know what standard I was at. I knew that there was going to be a squad of guys training at the AIS, and then most of the good New South Wales guys were there. So finding someone to row the pair with later in the season could prove difficult. All the permeations of how my workout swirled around me, but mostly I just got on with training and treated the time trials with more relevance than I might otherwise. Eventually, because I went well in these time trials, eventually I was offered a spot in Canberra. I'd probably demonstrated enough promise to be considered in the mix, but I felt very eager to prove I was an athlete that could not be ignored. It was during this period, post Princeton to Beijing, that my thinking shifted towards being intent on proving I could move a boat instead of having the same intention on actually moving boats. This wasn't as a black and white difference, but a shift in mentality over time. Although I felt confident in my ability, I never felt secure that how I felt and how I was being judged were the same. Drew again explained to me in 2011 that my need to prove myself was a limiting factor. And although I leveraged that need into energy and performances at times, it was ultimately negative. I've thought a lot about that since. I've tried to understand what Drew meant and didn't disagree, but couldn't figure out how I developed this siege mentality. Without getting too deep into my own psychoanalysis, I think I have a few clues. There are athletes that from day dot are encouraged, told that they have what it takes to make it. I do it myself. If I have a tall kid with some aerobic ability, I'll tell him that he should apply himself because he could be good at this sport. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. I was not one of those kids though. I have literally never been told by a single coach that I have what it takes to have what it takes or even could have what it takes to win an Olympic gold medal. Any belief I've ever had has been cultivated personally. I'm not so naive that I think this is a circumstance special to me, but I've spent a lot of time around people that have had the opposing experience, and I know the difference. At Princeton, it was a bit different because nobody received this encouragement explicitly, but everyone was given an equal opportunity. This, I realized, was not quite the experience in Canberra or in Australia, or at least in Canberra. The training and selection processes in Canberra in 2007, 2008, and 2009 and 2012. So basically, the whole time I was rowing on the national team were not fair or good. Most of the time, feedback was an explanation of all the ways in which the athlete was slowing down the boat. Instead of an environment where athletes felt confident to try and make changes, a general anxiousness permeated. I had to work really hard to remind myself of my attributes that positively contributed to boat speed. More often than not, the coaching and data strongly emphasized areas in need of improvement, and I get that. However, there should be information provided for the athlete to know what they are currently doing well. More often than not in Canberra, and this is where the Australian Institute of Sport is based in Canberra, where I lived and trained for 6 years. More often than not in Canberra, I felt like shit about my rowing because everything I was told pertained to my inadequacies. I want to welcome feedback, but I found myself more defensive and less open because when I've really listened and tried to take on board everything, I end up being a lot less sure about my ability. I felt like many times in Canberra, that was interesting. If I do A, B, C, and D and E wrong, what the fuck am I actually doing well? How am I even propelling this boat in the right direction? And how am I actually going faster than most of my peers? The problem is worse, and when coaches or auxiliary staff cannot correctly interpret data and make wrong deductions. If I hop on the erg and go 548 and some other guy goes 544, he has done better than me. If he's 105 kilograms and I'm 85 kilograms, maybe you can interpret the numbers with some subjectivity. However, when a biomechanist believes the numbers on the screen more accurately reflect the reality itself, everyone in the room knows it is bullshit. For example, you can take the vast majority of guys that have a high early peak in their biomechanical data, and I'm talking about high early peak power in the force curves for listeners. And this is getting into the minutia, but this is something that was very front of the process and relevant during this period of time. For example, you can take the vast majority of guys that have a high early peak in their biomech, and in reality, they don't get their blade covered until about halfway through the leg drive. The biomech measures when the bottom edge makes the slightest connection, but does not comprehend that this is not a meaningful contribution to boat propulsion. This is a real catch slip. On the other hand, what guys that might not be as direct but get full coverage when they do go in, this presents as catch slip. This is necessary feedback for both parties, but biomech doesn't discern, and our biomechanists rarely understand the difference. I've sat in many meetings where somebody who has never rowed will say something might be this or could be that. This indecision only serves to fragment the crew and provide a failed crutch for the coach. I think there is a place for biomech as a reference point, but in the time I've been on the Australian rowing team, it has been misappropriated as a selection tool and as a Rosetta Stone when in-boat problems occur. This is bullshit. It should be used as a resource, and everyone should be very clear on what they aim to get out of utilizing it. Biomech, accelerometers, and such are great when used appropriately, but they can and have been a massive distraction. A typical biomech meeting at any point in Canberra between 2006 and 2012 could include a crew going in with a few common objectives and technical priorities and leave with 8 guys thinking about completely different aspects of the stroke. Boat speed seems to be dependent on the crew's ability to be as syncopated as possible, and this is a constant challenge in the 8. With more guys, there is obviously a greater potential for crew fragmentation. The best way to allow for cohesion in the 8 is to keep things as simple as possible. Not simple as in stupid, but simple as in only as complicated as needed. One of the large differences between the Australian men's 8 and the New South Wales 8 over the last 6 years is the ability to keep it simple. Part of the difference has been out of necessity. With far less typical preparation time, we've learned that simplicity is key. Simplicity is key. When another key component is that we've agreed that we all employ different technical philosophies at other parts of the year and even in that regatta, but our ability to summon our forces in a few key areas is essential. This isn't some special Welshman ability either. I'd imagine this is how it's been done in all good King's Cup crews. The difference is that with more time and more resources, the Australian men's 8 has not enjoyed the same simplicity. Much of the well-intentioned work put into the 8 over the last little while has done a lot to disrupt its progress. This tendency to complicate is some of the reason that the 8 has performed well at trials or with some periods of preparation as compared to later in the season. When the crew is either not much faster, a similar speed, but relatively slower or just plain slower. Rarely has a recent Australian 8 improved their speed much between trials, which usually held in March or April, February to April, than at the Worlds and the Olympic Games. All I'm saying there is with much more time, focus, we'd gotten slower, not faster. At this point, I could go on as I have chronologically, but I think I'd already started towards the heart of the matter. If I want to be a member of a gold medal winning 8 in Rio, which is what I did, then I need to articulate past failures of the system and at the same time personal failures, as well as the few fundamental components I believe will advance the opportunity of the 8. Obviously, getting the right personnel is crucial, but the process for how that happens can have a dramatic effect on the eventual performance of the crew. I'd never understood the purpose of a selection regatta for the 8. I know what it's supposed to be, but for the 8, the regatta has primarily functioned as a stressful, protracted exercise for selectors to have enough proof to defend themselves from liability and appeals. The rationale for selections also changes when the athletes have been trialed constantly for the years and months prior. For the London 8, Olympic selection events included, but were not limited to, the New South Wales Championships, Nationals, December trials, erg testing, camps, racing in scratch combinations over 1,800 meters with 40-knot crosswinds, and biomech analysis reports from any session on any day. If the eventual coach of the 8 determines this is the best way to select the fastest possible crew, okay, but what is the point of having an event like selections to try and make the process appear confined to a specific period of time and for it to make it appear objective? The Germans, Poms, Yanks, and Canadians all have selection events, but all crews are eventually chosen subjectively. There is no way to select an 8 by numbers, and yet we have either tried to do that or to dress up an event to look like that. The only possible benefit of trials for the 8 is to see who performs when it really matters, but it rarely does this. Usually, some guys are trialed more than others, and people get by hiding in safe combinations. A better arena for big time performances is the World Championships, and yet these are disregarded. After the 8 won a bronze in 2010, which should have been able to preserve and develop a nucleus of the crew, the same goes for 2011. Both crews showed potential to be built upon, but every year we started over as though the previous year didn't exist. Suddenly, who was doing what in the single scull in November was considered more relevant than the previous year's World Championships. In the meantime, the athletes, sensing that they had been constantly trialed, adapt to their circumstance and place day-to-day performance ahead of the ultimate eventual performance at the World Championships or the Olympics. This difference is subtle, but over time, athletes become less willing to take risks in order to improve themselves because they don't want to appear weak or slow. Competitiveness in a training environment can be an asset, but if competition is fabricated where there shouldn't be, it manifests as something very ugly. The actual competitive spirit of the group gets slowly exhausted as they are constantly compared to each other. In this atmosphere, there is less focus on how am I moving the boat and more how am I moving the boat comparatively. I'm a pretty competitive guy, and I use the competition to fuel myself at times. This strength has been to my detriment on occasion because I focused on being better than everybody else and not on improving my craft. This is to say that I haven't worked to become a better oarsman, but too often I've gauged myself extrinsically. Although I've recognized this along the way, I've been hot and cold with controlling it. Since London, I've had significantly less difficulty. I do know how to control much of this. Sorry, I do not know how much of this should be attributed to not being in that environment as compared to personal growth, but there's a definitive difference. So what I'm saying is, in the time since London, which is a year, I'd improved this attribute. And I'm also saying is I don't know how much of that is my own personal development or that I wasn't in the national team environment. The challenge for me is to preserve this progress as I encounter situations, camp, for example, that seem similar to situations that may have posed the greatest challenges previously. I hope for the sake of all Australian rowing team athletes that selections have a clear objective and specified time frame. If the 8 is subjectively chosen, as so many others are, over a period of time that leads to an eventual selection, so be it. This is how the majority of international 8s are chosen as the coach sees fit. This might not seem fair, but performance at the Olympics is not based on fairness, and this is the fairest system. This is how every football team is chosen, but we've confused ourselves with data and objectivity. Selecting a fast 8, much like any other team, is a matter of alchemy more than science. What we cannot do is use that process and then have a selection regatta at the end. What is the point? I understand a crew being required to time trial in order to demonstrate sufficient speed, but not the rigmarole of tapering and losing training time for a selection regatta that has served no purpose. We also need to build on the strengths of the previous year and preserve the integrity of a crew if their performance warrants such treatment. Ideally, the 8 has a coach that understands what training will most benefit his athletes. I'm assuming that the coach is a male there, which from all of the 8s that I was in, that was the case, but just to add a little 2025 caveat there. Although I have my own personal thoughts on how to best prepare a crew, I'd love to step back and feel confident in giving myself to the process and trusting the training. I have not been able to do that while on the Australian rowing team. I was going to detail the specifics of how we've failed to prepare appropriately, but that'll probably be exhausting for all concerned. However, I will explain why it's easier said than done for me when trust the process. For me, it's why it's easier said than done for me to trust the process, as so many have recommended. In 2007, the 4 was obligated to follow the same training program as the 8. This castrated Randy, this is Andrew Randall, castrated Randy, who was our coach in 2007, and ensured that our ambitions were restricted to a strategy devised by physiologists and limited by certain personnel within the 8. In 2008, the program was more influenced by hypothetical physiology and was an absolute disaster in advancing boat speed. And I've talked about this previously, but here we go again. I've talked about it previously on this podcast, but here we go again. An absolute disaster in advancing the boat speed of a group of guys that had potential to go very fast. When we were in Queensland for our pre-Olympic camp, part of this training included the entire 8 erging in a minuscule space with tights, long sleeve shirts, beanies, with a heat above 30 degrees and the humidity palpable. The day or two after this, everybody was some version of exhausted, and doing it every few days meant that we were finding it progressively hard to go fast. The problem with this wasn't the hard work. It was that the easy sessions in the hot room were crippling. Everybody put their best foot forward and didn't object, and so it went. Nobody factors this in or any other relevant details into assessing the performance of the Beijing 8 and what led up to it. I think our Olympic final was raced at about 20 degrees, and only the first day in China was hotter than a standard day to typical New South Wales champs. Training in that hot room also initiated a heart condition of mine that persists today. The condition, supraventricular tachycardia, is why Nathan Cohen had to withdraw. This is Olympic gold medalist Nathan Cohen, had to withdraw from the Kiwi men's quad recently. There's a chance that my condition would have occurred at some point along the way, but that's when it started. I'm capable of managing my condition and have become an expert at avoiding episodes in racing, but if I have to erg in a hot room with no airflow, I'm almost certain to fail. For those reading that are not aware, an episode usually involves my heart rate going from 160, 170 to 220 plus in an instant. My power used to drop off instantly, but now I can keep going for about another 30 seconds or so. My heart rate usually returns to normal when I stop, but the greater amount of time I spend with the heart rate elevated, the more tired I am, and this is noticeable in the next day. My heart condition aside, too off training for the 8 has not targeted the areas needed to win races in that boat class, nor has it been vigorous enough. It's not as though we haven't worked hard. We have, but not hard enough. Certain aspects of racing the men's 8 are undeniable. For example, that it's important to have a fast first 500 and 1,000. This is always the case, but this is always the case, but disproportionately so in the 8. We should have discussed this prior to London, that the winners of the men's 8 from 2000 onwards have led at the 500-meter mark 90% of the time and led at the 1,000-meter mark 100% of the time. We knew this, but did not develop that specific skill. I'm not sure how much influence the magical make-believe erg scores from 2009 to 2012 had, but it seemed that because numbers looked impressive, we had loads of horsepower. And that's because from 2009 to 2012, this is just me ad-libbing here, Rowing Australia decided that it would make sense for all of our ergs training and testing to be on slides as opposed to on the ground as static, as it had been in every year previous and in every year post 2012. So they abandoned this about the same time that I'd mentioned it. I think we had relatively strong physiology, but not as strong as the numbers would have you believe. Having 4 guys with 541 or under, with 2Ks 541 or under, gave us a false impression. The major discrepancies of our training have been focusing on the wrong stuff, outsourcing programming, not working hard enough, and making it far more complicated than it needs to be. The best case scenario going forward is to have a coach that is confident, consistent, and runs the program with consultation as needed with others. The momentum of preparation is so important in the 8, and we need to be honest about what is required and where we are at all stages. A fault of ours in the past is not being dogged about what achieving the targeted speeds and times that we've been designated in training. We need to be harder with this. Personally, I feel that in many regards, I've made more progress in my training in the year since London as compared to the 6 years prior. This isn't based on particular scores, but on the confidence I feel. Being able to pay attention, make mistakes, adapt, and adjust has made training enjoyable. As I spend more time in and around SASI, South Australian Sports Institute, it'll be important for me to develop trust with Jason Lane, who was the head coach at SASI at the time. The coaching I've received in Canberra did very little for my confidence and personal development. But during that time, I've also had coaches that have supported their athletes, and I'm optimistic about training in Adelaide. Taking a year away from international rowing has given me an opportunity to disseminate some of my mistakes and determine what I could have done better. Many times this system has failed my teammates and myself, and this has made me angry. I've seen the effort of good athletes be wasted by a system that has been too focused on the bureaucratic process and not enough on winning gold medals. My resentment has been generated by countless stupid decisions that have negatively affected our performances. Ultimately, my attitude, no matter how justified, has also been detrimental. In 2009, I determined that if I wanted to win a gold medal in the 8 in 2012, the best contribution I could make would be to start from ground level. My heart was in the right place, and I was prepared to make the best contribution I could. Despite my hopes from the very beginning, I felt ill at ease. At the end of 2008, I met Noel Donaldson, who was the coach of our program from 2009 to 2012, which was my second Olympic campaign. I met Dono to discuss my plans for the future, and it was at that time I felt the entire burden of responsibility for the performances of the 8 in Beijing sat with me. In 2009, I was the only member of the Beijing 8 that fronted up, and for my troubles, I got a pile of shit heaped on me. When I look at myself rowing in Beijing, I can identify technical aspects that could clearly be better and that I was more tense than optimal. But Dono determined that my portion of that result was significantly more than the 1/9, which was the reality. I was 1/9 of the crew, 1/8 of the oarsmen, and 1/10 of the collective. In 2008, which is to say, my contribution was 10%, not 100% of the result. In 2008, I was a younger member of a crew with a lot of Olympic experience, and I bit my tongue at times because I trusted that the relevant people knew something I didn't. I was wary that we weren't preparing as well as possible, but put that aside because I wanted to be part of the process and not question it. I had been vocal at times. Prior to the Munich World Cup, I suggested that we initiate all pieces with a full racing start. This is not any sort of revolutionary idea, but as we were going to go straight from Canberra to racing in Munich, it seemed beneficial to add in some practice at getting the boat out and up to speed without having to curtail our base training with too much start-specific training. In Munich, we had close to a full length at the 500-meter mark and eventually won the race, beating the eventual Olympic silver medalist, Great Britain, in the second place. After Munich, we discontinued what I'd felt had been a pretty beneficial, that's just a typo, what I felt had been pretty beneficial. And when I asked Richo about it, he said something along the lines of, Munich showed we know how to start, so we don't need to practice that anymore. I disagreed internally, but kept my opinion to myself and got on with it. In Lucerne, we were never in the race and came fourth. There are many reasons for this, but I had mixed feelings going forward in the process without question. I put those feelings aside and got on with the eventual hot room erg and subpar training in Queensland, all the while trusting that things would turn out all right. Why wouldn't it be? We had James Tompkins in the boat and he knew what was required. Post Beijing, I never assigned blame to anyone inside or outside the boat for our performance. I accepted that as a member of the crew, I was responsible and I'd have to live with the result. However, I was not prepared to accept all the responsibility. Richo had gone. Jimmy, Steve Stewart, Marty Rabjohns, Dave Dennis, Tom Lorich, James Chapman, Sam Conrad had all stepped away from the sport, and Jeremy Stevenson was only partially present. That's just because he was in in Western Australia, so he wasn't around as much as I was. Nobody was there but me, and there was never a debrief. But our underperformance needed to be attributed to someone or someone, and it felt like me. Something obviously went very wrong in our race for us to be as far back as we were, but I knew I'd never given up and had done everything I could. Dono made me feel that I'd quit, ruined the rhythm, and was responsible for the poor preparation leading up to the regatta. What was I to say? If he'd felt like and had an opportunity going forward to prove, I felt if he felt like that, I had an opportunity going forward to prove he was wrong. I also felt that I hadn't been vocal enough and was determined to not ever be that again. When it came to select the eight in 2009, I became resentful that some of the guys in the crew were not, in my opinion, going to be anywhere near featuring in London. Dono, perhaps sensing this, decided that we needed to get tough and utilize Canberra winter to make things as unpleasant as possible. We showed glimpses of potential. We were very close to qualifying directly for the final. This is in the 2013 World Championships. We were level with the Germans at 1,000 meters, but got beaten by them and overhauled by Great Britain in the final 500 meters and forced into the repechage by 0.05 of a second. I was angry that our toughness in training wasn't there when it counted and we'd beaten ourselves. If we'd rode our best in the rep, we'd have easily qualified for the final, but our inexperience and a lack of aggression in a situation that rewards assertiveness cost us dearly. I'd been very upset because we'd clearly underperformed, but it also felt like I'd been let down. Stupid mistakes, for example, like one of the guys having Doritos for dinner, I later learned, the night before the rep, taking bicarb and having diarrhea with such regularity that we missed our entire warm-up and had to row directly to the start line. This is for the repechage. Didn't help our prospects. After the rep, Dono and I had a chat, and he explained that I was still carrying my feelings about the heat into the rep, and my anger was not constructive. He was absolutely right, and I realized I'd let the team down also. We rallied somewhat for the B final, but I was kicking myself for not being more supportive of my teammates. Although I knew I could have contributed more positively, I was still shitty about the whole season as we went out in Poznan that night. I subsequently embarrassed myself and the team by getting arrested and locked up until the following afternoon in some strange Polish dungeon. That's an actual story. I was arrested in Poland in 2013 after the World Championships. I'll elaborate on it more extensively, but let's see if I delve into it here. The reason I was arrested is partly because I was a drunk asshole and partly because I didn't manage my swirling emotions well. The big official after party was being held at a club, and a whole bunch of us Australians arrived after eating and drinking elsewhere. When we arrived, the bouncers said they were at capacity and nobody was coming in. A bit disappointing, but fair enough. As we were milling about, trying to figure out where to go, one of my teammates said something like, one of the bouncers hit so-and-so. I'm not going to name him, but one of the bouncers hit one of the guys on our team. That sort of thing is likely to summon a response in me at the best of times, and still down on myself about not aiding my teammates. I was standing directly in front of the bouncer, giving him shit in an instant. There was a big iron gate between the many rowers trying to get in and the entrance of the club, and the bouncers were directly on the other side of that. Any rower that tried to get in through the gate was pushed out, and some down the set of stairs leading up to the gate. After a guy was grabbed by his hair and tossed, and a girl pushed pretty violently, I felt I needed to try and do something and to stand up for the rowers who had been invited to that club. I couldn't do anything other than try and discourage people from trying to push their way in, and to tell the most aggressive of the bouncers exactly how I felt about him, which contained a lot of colorful language and was very poor form on my part. I figured that if this guy was occupied with me, then he was less likely to be manhandling other people. I eventually realized this was an exercise in futility, decided enough was enough, and walked about 100 meters away to where a group of our guys were standing. As I was standing, I could see my teammates that I was opposite react to something approaching behind me. And before I knew it, there was a whole SWAT team of guys grabbing my hands from behind my back and smashing my face onto the bonnet of a car. At this time, the bouncer I'd been giving grief to appeared and started spitting on my face. This is all true story. I was then walked to the cop car, and so it went. When I got out the following afternoon, I knew I'd been an idiot and let myself down. Despite not breaking any laws, I knew I'd done this and couldn't blame anyone but myself. That being said, given the entirety of the situation, it would be understandable if Rowing Australia actually stood up for me. I believe that's what many other countries would have done. Given this was in Poland, there was clearly a whole bunch of corruption going on. I understood that the priority was to get me out of jail and back to Australia with the rest of the team. What I did not expect was to be at my family home in Sydney and summoned to Canberra with zero notice. There's some names mentioned here, but to attend a meeting with the bureaucracy at Rowing Australia at the time to basically explain myself. From then on, I knew that no one was going to stand up for me. I knew I'd done the wrong thing, and this was clearly an instance of bad taste and poor form, but not anything malicious. I hadn't hit anyone, broke any laws, damaged any property, and had tried to stand up to what I thought was wildly over the top bouncing. The wash up that I was to undergo a version of anger management with one of the psychologists at the IS. I knew the reasons behind my actions that got me in trouble, and we spent very little time delving into that. What was very useful was getting some perspective about some of the other rowing specific aspects that I'd allowed to develop into a potentially negative mindset. I was extremely resentful and still am that Rowing Australia had taken the position that I was the problem that needed to be fixed and had not stood up for me. When I can compare my treatment to those of some footy players who were defended by their club after some wildly egregious behavior, I couldn't help but feel that my team wasn't really there for me. If I were to compare my treatment to that of, I don't want to elaborate, but one of my teammates in London threw a bit of concrete, a garden bed, through a shop window. He was a good bloke, and it's not his fault, but I felt like he'd been stood up for. So comparison to that, it'd be easy to see how I'd feel a little hard done by. I don't know what it is about me that seemingly discourages encouragement and support. I know I must have a significant role in that, but I'd really like it to change. The most significant strides I made in some of my feelings of disappointment have been in the last 12 months. My hope is that some of this stuff, which I've needlessly carried with me, can be left behind after writing it down. Although I'm not wrong for feeling the way I do about certain things, unless I let some of this stuff go, I'll end up punishing future teammates for the bullshit that they have nothing to do with. What I'd hope to carry forward is some of the lessons I've learned. Although there are aspects of my results that were outside of my control, I've had to get real with my accountability. In 2009, for example, I was so shitty that I had to row with certain athletes that I failed to get over my own bullshit and improve the situation. Instead of being a hard ass trying to only lead by example, I could have actually encouraged some of those guys more. Maybe if I'd worked harder on that, we wouldn't have guys eating Doritos for dinner. Although my heart was always been in the right place, too often I've been dogmatic and difficult. Although I still believe that there is usually a right way and a wrong way, I've had to step back and understand that there's more to it than that. Some of my experiences have negatively impacted those aspects of my mentality, but it's time to let go and move on. My ambition for Beijing was all about the eight. I wasn't concerned with priority boats at all. I wanted to be in the eight to pursue its own course, like many of our successful small boats have been able to. My best case scenario is for that to occur in Rio. I think we've had enough. I think we have enough guys with experience and plenty of hungry youngsters to really develop a good crew, but only if given the opportunity. After watching the final of the eight in Korea, that's in the 2013 World Champs, it's clear to me that we can really do it, but not if we have to spend time every year as part of the four trialing, for example. The eight does not need to be Australia's priority boat, but it does need to be a priority for some of Australia's priority athletes. I could imagine a scenario where a four of guys focused on the eight could race the four at something like nationals and win, but that shouldn't mean that all those guys are then forced to be in contention to have to trial for the four. I've enjoyed racing the four domestically and internationally, but having lots of guys that can row the four well has damaged the ability of the eight. Personally, I see myself continuing rowing if we're serious about the 8. If not, then I'd first consider a smaller boat that could potentially suit my stature and natural stroke, something like the double, or pull the plug altogether. I feel like I've got plenty of hard strokes left in me, and that in a better environment, I can keep making headway in some of the areas that have potentially limited me in the past. Since Nationals, I've had a pretty good block of training. Up to June, I was doing a lot of volume on the erg in preparation for the 24-hour world record. So Matt Ryan and I broke the 24-hour world record on the erg in the few months prior to this letter. Cautious of the detrimental effects of all that very specific volume, I spent a fair chunk of time in the gym to make sure I kept strong through different ranges of motion. In spending that time in the gym, I was able to recognize that strength is an attribute of mine that I'd neglected a bit over the years. Compared to my aerobic ability, strength has always come easily, and in an effort to improve my weaknesses, I've forgotten about my strengths. Knowing that as Rio approaches, the weights, etc., will become progressively less prominent, I've taken the time now to get my base back while working on my aerobic attributes. That's to get my strength base back while working on my aerobic attributes. I'm also consolidating that stuff that will give me the most bang for my buck down the line. Post 24-hour erg, I've added in running and cycling back in, and have been building volume with those. I've started erging again 2 weeks after the 24-hour erg with some running also, and have been adding in more aerobic threshold work than prior to July. I spoke with Jason Lane prior to his departure overseas and discussed getting back into the boat in the 3rd week of September. This is some of the minutiae at the time. My intention is to participate in all required activities until selections, or to a point where I feel more decided one way or the other. I'm entirely committed to the idea, but I want to have knowledge of what I'm signing up for. A lot of the conversations I've had about the 8 are really positive, but we need guys starting the process, and that's what I'm hoping to do. I've spoken with Francis Hegarty about rowing the pair, and appropriate discussions have adjusted my work with rowing in mind. I've tried to detail some of the issues that have stifled myself and the 8 in the past, and hopefully it's time to move on from some of those. Others are personal areas in need of refinement, and I'll continue to work on those whilst welcoming feedback where possible. Okay, so I sent that 14 pages. For those of you that are still listening, seem to find it interesting, and I felt like I agree with all of that right now, 8 years later. It's none of that I'd really change. Some of it I may have softened in the delivery, but I was trying to own my deficiencies and where I knew I could improve, but also that there'd been some failings in the system that needed addressing for me to sign up for another 4 years with the Australian rowing team, which is what I wanted to do. The feedback I got was, so from one person, I sent it to 2 people. That's because those were the 2 people I was told to send it to. It says a very interesting and honest assessment plus reflection. Good to read what you felt you played, what role you felt you played in this journey as well. It is something I would have to reread to fully appreciate the messages and thoughts you have put down. This was sent 22 hours afterwards. I don't feel like the person that responded actually read the email. I think they saw somewhere that I'd owned my portion of it, but that it was 14 pages and they didn't read it. The other person I sent it to, 0 response. So for all of that, the only response I got was just what I read you. A very interesting and honest assessment plus reflection. Good to read what role you felt and you played in the journey as well. It is something I would have to reread to fully appreciate the messages and thoughts you have put down. And from that, nothing. No, nothing, no fucking nothing. And unfortunately, that indicated to me all I needed to know, which was that there was minimal chance for the Australian 8 to be successful in Rio. And unfortunately, that was confirmed when in 2015, the men's 8, who had a lot of talent, didn't qualify for the Olympic Games via the World Cup, via the World Championships in 2015. Missed qualification, went to the Regatta of Death, the final Olympic qualification regatta in Lucerne in 2016. I didn't qualify there either, so there was no Australian men's eight at the Rio Olympics. So worse than sixth place is not fucking being there. And that's largely because none of the stuff that had said was improved. And I'm not sure if it has been improved since. So I'm glad that for you listener or viewer, you're able to get a little bit of a behind the scenes of my reflections on that time and why it's hard for me to be entirely positive about my Olympic journey. Why I have my frustrations with the national team that most people aren't prepared to speak publicly about because they might have the same reflections of their version of it that I do. And then they finish rowing with a bad taste in their mouth, and then no one gives a fuck, so they move on with their lives. And given that what I wrote there, which I obviously put some time into, did nothing for me, nothing for anyone else, perhaps no one even read it. I want someone, if you're listening to it now, you know, which is better than not knowing, because we can either kick things or brush things under the rug and nothing changes. There's a reason that no Australian men's eight has won an Olympic gold medal. And there's a reason that no Australian men's eight has medaled in the last 20 years. And I would love nothing more than for that not to be the case and for things to change in the future. But if things don't change, nothing changes. On that positive note, thanks for being here. If you enjoy it, give it a thumbs up or a 5 stars, but more importantly, maybe share it with someone that you think would be interested. The best way to keep this thing going is for me to have more people listening to it. And the best way for that to happen is for you, the Keen Bean, to spread the word. Regardless, I thank you for being here with me. And I, in general, try to be more positive than not and optimistic that things will change. I wrote that letter with the belief that there was scope for things to change. They didn't change, and that's what gives me the shits. I took no joy in my mates and teammates not being able to qualify the eight because nothing changed in 2015, 2016. Nothing had changed in that quadrennium. And obviously the remnants of that still there, despite having a lot of success in the men's eight. In the following quadrenniums, we still not have been able to put it together at the Olympic Games, despite the amount of money that we have been pumped into it, despite having athletes that we know can perform internationally. We have not been successful. And I can tell you why, but nothing will happen if the people in charge don't make the necessary changes. I can't speak to all the different boat classes. All of the different boat classes aren't my concern. My concern is the eight, the men's eight, but I'd imagine the women's eight has many of the same issues. We have had a lot of success, especially recently, in small boats, and think that the way that you select and coach and train those can be extrapolated to the eight, but we know that's not the case because the results are there and the proof is in the pudding. Wishing me health, wishing you health and all the very best, and I'll talk to you next week.